everybody, John at IPT Trans. Today we're installing the TL-175 Shift Kit. Get tons of calls, tons of emails, tons of people doing it wrong. We're probably going to break this down into 3 or 4 parts, so keep tuned for all of them. Okay, first things first, we want to stay organized. There's a bunch of different length bolts here, and you don't want to put them in the wrong spot and make any mistakes like that. So first we're going to take the solenoids off. Alright, these 2 bolts here, and then 6 more. This is a 1G valve body, so instead of 3 solenoids up here, plus the pressure control, we have 2 and a block-off plate. So this is your main difference between the 1G and the 2G that you're going to see. Now when you put these solenoids back on, they have to go in the right spot, obviously. So we're always going to have yellow, orange, then if it's a 2G, you're going to have the red. And the pressure control is going to have blue wires going to it. Now we have these bolts. I'm going to put them in this tray all in one spot. So all our solenoid bolts are going to be in one spot. And we're also going to remove this plate that is bolted to the valve body that holds the solenoids. Okay, it just kind of comes right off. Now also, we have the manual valve, which we're going to take out. And we have 2 more bolts that hold a bracket that looks like this and the end of the wiring harness. Okay, and again, all the solenoid stuff's going to stay in one little pile here. So this is what we end up with: pressure control, your 2 shift solenoids, the plate, and the wiring harness. Okay. The next piece we're going to take off is the top valve body piece. And we're also going to keep these bolts in a separate section. Okay, so all of these are going to get their own little spot in the tray also. And when you take this off, you're going to have a metal separator plate and the lower valve body. What I also do is on these valve bodies, I'm not going to take the bolts out of the end plates, but I'm going to loosen them all up, which is going to make it easier to clean. Now under here, we're going to have 1 steel check ball. And if you want, you could kind of mark its location. So we have 1 steel check ball. Then we have a spring. And there's another check ball underneath that. Okay. We're going to take the rest of the valve body bolts out. The remaining ones are pretty easy. They're all the same length except for 1. And I'll show you that one different one when we put it back together. I'll lift this piece off. And we have our other separator plate. Now in the main part of the valve body, we're going to have 4 check balls that you have to mark, and there's 2 retainers. Just take careful note of where these 2 retainers go. A lot of people put them in the wrong spot, it'll give you shifting problems. This one typically will not fall out. This one always will. Okay? So if you want, maybe you put a little mark in the spot where that one goes back. And also you'll see there's a little valve in here the valve has to always be on top of the retainer when you put this back together. Okay? Now what else is going to fall out is your neutral to dry valve. Okay? We're going to do something with that later. Right, same thing here. I'm loosening up these end plates. This one I'm going to take all the bolts out, except for the two on the end. It looks like this valve body may have a shift kit in it already, but that doesn't matter for our purposes. I'm still going to show you everything that you got to do. Now, you're going to have a few more bolts in your check balls and the one horseshoe clip that falls out. Okay. On most of these valve bodies you're going to have steel check balls, but this one already has the updated Thorlon ones because, as I said, it has a shift kit in it already. Alright, so you're going to put this all to the side. And what you do now is give it a good cleaning. I mean, you probably don't have a tank like this, but you want to clean anything with, mineral spirits or brake clean or however you want to do it, but it's real important for this to be very, very clean. After you clean it, I wouldn't recommend blowing it with air because that's how things come flying out and getting lost, so I would just turn it over and let it air dry for the most part. Alright, we have everything laid out. As I said, we keep all the bolts separately for each section. Now they're arranged by length. Okay, so these are the bolts that hold the valve body halves together. These are the bolts that hold the solenoids to the valve body. And these are the bolts that hold the lower valve body to the main valve body. Solenoids are here. Now down here, these are all the parts from the shift kit. I have them set up where the parts that you're going to use in the lower valve body are in one spot, and the parts in the upper valve body are in another spot. And then we have these two other parts, which we're probably going to not use, and I'm going to tell you about that and why. We also have drill bits that come with the kit. So we have everything cleaned up and laid out, nice and dry and clean. The first thing we're going to do is drill out the separator plate according to the instructions that come with this kit. Alright, something to take note of here. This comes with an instruction sheet, but I'm not going to be going in the order that this is in necessarily. So just try and follow along, and everything that I'm saying is probably in this instruction sheet, but we're going to skip a couple steps that I think should probably be omitted. Alright, two separator plates in this thing. They're both going to need holes drilled. Now this is real important to take note of. These things have a tendency to wear out one of the holes. Okay, this hole is underneath that steel check ball and that relief spring that we took out before. When it looks like that, there's no fixing it. I mean, what we got to do is get another separator plate. Alright, and the new separator plates, as to the time we're making this anyway, are still available at the dealer under that part number. Hey everybody, welcome to the TransLab Shift Kit video part 2. Alright, all these hole sizes are in the instructions. You could kind of mark the plate like this to show you what holes to drill. I usually start with the small ones. I've drilled this hole to 55 thousandths as per the instructions. The rest of them are different sizes, but I do all the same sizes at once. So that one hole is going to be a 67, as are these two holes in the other separator plate. Alright, this next hole is 93 thousandths. And this other hole what we're going to do is make the factory hole a lot bigger. Then we're going to install a plug into it and then drill it smaller. So basically, we're going to end up reducing that hole size. This is a step a lot of people mess up. They'll do something like not drill this out after they put the plug in, and it'll give you no reverse. Or they'll call up and you know, based on these instructions, it tells you based on what size band you have is how you have to drill this hole. Now, almost everybody here is using what's going to be the wide band, which is your turbo transmission. Okay, so the final hole is going to get drilled to a number 35 drill bit, which is 110 thousandths. But anyway, these are the steps. First, we drill that, and what I like to do is get a bigger drill bit. 5/16, 3/8, doesn't really matter, and I just kind of touch these hole size on both sides. Okay, so what I've done is put a bevel on both sides because that's going to enable it to hold the plug better. Now when you put the plug in, you want a real hard flat surface. Okay, this plug comes in the shift kit, so what you're going to want to do is lay the plug down on your flat surface, and you want to get this side of the separator plate because it goes up against the trans case. This is going to save you some trouble. I'm going to put this down over the plug. Okay. We're always going to start from the other side. What we're going to do is this several times. And that's going to expand the plug into that hole. Okay, and you want to make sure it's in there nice and tight. Also, in the instructions, it tells you once you do this to file the plate because it's going to be sticking up a little bit. And this isn't in the instructions. I like to get something sharp and just kind of find the middle of this plug and make a little dimple in it. At which point I'm going to get a small drill bit. A 1/16 of an inch usually works pretty well. And I'm going to drill through with that. Alright, that's going to make it a lot easier to keep everything more nicely centered when we drill it out to 110 thousandths, which is a number 35 drill bit. Okay, this is what it's supposed to look like when it's done. At that point, I'm going to get another drill bit. And all these holes that I've drilled, I just give them a quick chamfer on both sides. I'm probably not going to interfere with anything, but it's just kind of a nicer way to do it. It's just a habit I've been in over the years. Oh, and it looks like we missed one of the holes, so let me do that one. Be this one here, which is also 93 thousandths or a number 42 drill bit. And these drill bits all come in the kit, except for the two larger ones. But those are, you know, stuff you probably have laying around, a regular fractional drill. Okay, so we have our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 holes in this plate and 2 in the small plate, and that's it for drilling holes. Alright, we're going to start changing our springs now, and do these one at a time. Don't start taking the whole valve body apart. We're going to work with one valve and spring at a time so nothing gets confused or put in the wrong spot. Okay, we're starting with the end clutch control valve, and this is kind of a little tricky to get out. There's a little pin that retains it, and what you have to do is turn the valve body over and kind of press on the end plug a bit. And kind of vibrate the pin out. You'll hear it fall like that. Okay? Okay, after the retainer comes out and the pin, there's going to be another piece in here. It's kind of like a spring seat. So you're going to have to grab that with needle nose pliers and kind of walk that out. Sometimes they're a little tough to get out, but just be gentle and it'll come out. Underneath here is your end clutch control spring. Shake it, the valve's going to come out. Okay? This is how everything sits in there. So this spring we're going to replace with the yellow spring from the Shift Kit. And another thing to note, I mean, I've done all this already, but each time you get a valve out, you want to spray it with a little brake clean and also spray out its bore and clean each one individually. You have to have this super clean. Otherwise you're going to have valve stick. And another thing you want to take note of is a valve, when you put it in, has to fall with its own weight to the bottom of the bore. I don't know if you could hear that. If it's not doing that, it's not free and you have to clean it up some more. Alright, now we put our spring. And our end spring retainer. Now this end cap, kind of have to push it in perfectly straight. And when this big hole lines up with the pin, it'll drop in. And then the same thing is when you take it out, you have to vibrate it a little bit and it'll kind of walk down in there. Okay, next we're going to take off this end cap. Okay. This is what it looks like. You also have an adjuster for your reducing pressure valve spring. This valve body is a 1G, so there's a difference between the 1G and the 2G in this area. This converter control valve is simply going to have a plug in a 1G unit. If this was a 2G, you'd be removing this valve and you'd be putting a brown spring underneath it. This next valve we don't have to do anything with, but I'm going to take it out and show you how it goes in there in case it falls out on you and you have to know how to put it back together. Get the spring first and then the valve. Okay, next is your reducing pressure valve. You don't have to take it out, you can just change the spring, but I like to, as I said before, clean it up and make sure everything is in there freely. Now with this valve, the Shift Kit's going to give you a choice between a light blue spring and a dark blue spring. I don't know, based on diameter of the valve. But to be honest with you, I've never ever used anything besides the dark blue spring. Okay, now you're going to put this back on. This whole retainer has to sit inside the valve. So we have to kind of push this on and sneak one of the bolts in here. Once you have the one bolt in, you can put your other two and tighten them down. Just be careful, you want to make sure everything's going in there straight. Okay? In the shift kit they talk about an adjustment for this valve. Okay, changing this spring seat height is going to affect shift firmness. Regardless of what the instructions say, the closer that this piece is to the valve body, the firmer your shift is going to be. So I like to start with a baseline. This is a 4mm socket. You could use pliers if you don't have a 4mm socket. Most people don't. Turning this counterclockwise until the seat contacts the valve body. The adjustment I like to start with is from this point. I then turn it 2 turns clockwise. Okay? Clockwise loosens the adjustment, counterclockwise makes it tighter. Alright, so if you want to play with shift firmness, you want it firmer, you're always going to turn it counterclockwise. You want it softer, you're going to turn it clockwise. Hey everybody, welcome to part 3 of the TransLab Shift Kit video. Okay, now we're going to move to the next part of the valve body. We have only 2 bolts in here, so we took the rest of them out before. We're going to take those 2 bolts out. Now, as I suggested, you should work with one valve at a time, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to take them all out at once. Okay, I have all these valves out, some of which you're going to have to change the springs, some of them you don't have to touch, but I took them all out for the purpose of illustration. Alright, first off is the pressure control valve. I get this question a lot. In the shift kit you have a choice between a red spring and a black spring. The black spring gives you firmer shifts. To be quite honest, I never use the red spring. It's kind of a waste of time. So we're going to change the spring on this valve and install it into the valve body. This next valve is the torque converter clutch regulator valve, and you're going to put the orange spring from the shift kit on that valve. And you have to kind of gently put these valves into place. Next up is the pressure regulator valve, and that is a white spring out of the shift kit. Now this valve, you don't have to change the spring, and it's nothing different via the shift kit, but this is one of these horseshoe clips that can fall out. Normally it won't, but once you release tension from this valve by taking the end plate off, it can. So you want to always make sure that goes in the same spot. Then you have the valve that goes in first, and you'll see it has a hollow end for the spring to sit in, just so we don't have that in there backwards. Next is the rear clutch control valve. This is actually 2 valves in the lineup. You're going to switch this spring with the purple one from the shift kit. The shift valve on the end you don't have to do anything with, but just take note of its position and how it goes in here in case it falls out on you. Now this might be kind of tough to see. When you put this back together, you have an adjustment seat for the pressure regulator valve. I'm going to take the spring out real quick just to show you how it has to go. When you put that end piece on, this has to engage into that slot. Alright? So, what I like to do is put this piece on, and there's actually a hole, whoops, there's actually a hole that the adjuster sits through. You want to make sure that that's indexed correctly to fit down into that slot. This is kind of tough to do while I'm able to have you guys see it on camera. What we're going to do is get 2 bolts in here loosely while we're holding pressure down with our thumb. And I don't know if we could see in here, this slot has to hold the adjuster plate. Now I'm going to tighten these down a little bit and put the rest of my bolts in. Alright, now we have another adjustment for the pressure regulator valve. I don't know what the shift kit says, to be honest with you. What I do is I turn it counterclockwise till it stops, and then I typically go clockwise 1 turn. Alright, so we have a pretty high pressure adjustment. Next, we have this valve, and the shift kit tells you to put this tight coil spring on the end of it. Alright, basically what we're doing here is keeping this valve from moving altogether. I don't like to use this because I see them get twisted up and they can cause problems. So what I do is I get one of the check balls, steel check balls that we're not going to use, and I drop it down in the bore, and then I put the valve in. Alright, so basically this valve is immobilized. And just while you're working with this valve body, just be careful. This, this can fall back out. Next, this valve I told you about before, we have to kind of make sure that it's pushed outboard as far as possible. And then we're going to put our horseshoe clip back in. Okay? That's how that goes. Now, let me set this up. Maybe you could see it better if I do it this way. We have 4 check balls that we're going to put in. Okay, that's where they all go. Now what you could do, especially if you're putting it right in the car, it really doesn't matter, but if it's going to be sitting for any length of time or anything like that, you want to kind of lube it up some. Alright, now we're going to put that on the side for now. Hey everybody, welcome to the final part of the TransLab Shift Kit video. Okay, now we're going to lay the separator plate onto the channel plate of the valve body. This solenoid plate that we're going to put on has 2 dowel pins to locate everything. We put that down and just kind of by eyeball make sure all the bolt holes are centered. When you get to that point, you're going to get these 2 short bolts, and you can put them in this plate hand tight. Okay, next we're going to put our solenoids on. This being a 1G has 3 solenoids. What you're going to want to look out for is that there's an O-ring on each of these solenoids. Make sure that's in place. The pressure control solenoid has a rubber seal. Usually that's not going to fall out of place and nothing can happen to that, but just be aware that it's there. What I usually do first is put the pressure control solenoid on. I get 2 more of these short bolts, which are the same length as the ones we've just used. And we have to start them from the opposite side of the valve body. What I'm going to do is turn this over, and you're going to see there's a ground strap on this solenoid. Take one of the bolts back out, put it through the ground strap, then I'm going to tighten them down. Now we have our two shift solenoids. As I mentioned before, the yellow one is going to be outboard, then the orange one is going to be inboard of that. We're reusing the solenoids. The wires are kind of going to be molded to a position where they were. Let's kind of route them the same way. Now we're going to have 4 bolts that are the same length that we're going to use to put these two solenoids on. And again, they're going to thread in from the opposite side. Now we're going to have this block off plate. What has to happen here is we have a wire bracket. We're going to have 2 different length bolts, a short one and a long one. The long one is going to go further inboard. Oops. The next one is going to go through this bracket that holds the wires. That's going to be the shorter of the 2. Okay. Then we're going to turn this over, tighten these. I'm just kind of sending them down with this. We're going to torque them later. Now these 2 other bolts that we did finger tight before, we're going to loosen the one up and put our ground strap in. Something to note is not all the solenoid types have a ground strap coming off of them. Some of them are grounded straight through the solenoid. So if you don't see that, don't worry too much about it. Now, this bracket that we took off before, we have to put back on, and it goes under this other bracket that holds the wires, like so. Now these bolts are easier to identify because they have little lock washers on them. And these I'm only going to put in finger tight because we're going to tighten them up later. Okay. Next we have our main valve body, and we're going to get the channel plate part of the valve body, and we're going to put this down on top of it. Now when we do this, this bracket that's hand tight is going to engage into this area. And also be careful that you don't jostle this thing and have any of your check balls come flying out or anything like that. And what I kind of do is hold it up by hand. Now the bolts for this are all the same size except for one. It's a little bit lighter in color and it's a little bit shorter, and that is going to go into this hole here. Now I'm going to take these down a little bit, but they're still going to be loose. So we still have another section to put on. Now something I failed to mention before is that you're going to have a little screen in here. Okay, so always make sure that goes back. Now we're going to have our pressure relief ball. Okay, you could use a steel ball, but what's preferable is to use the Thorlon ball out of the shift kit, because that's going to be less likely to wear that separator plate out. Okay, so that goes here. Whoops. And then the other check ball goes here. Now we have our lower valve body and its separator plate. I'm going to lay that down on top here. This step is optional. I kind of like to do it. I have a couple bolts that are studs. There's two holes here that are for alignment purposes, so you kind of can stick those in there to line everything up, and then you can put the rest of your bolts back. And this is where you got to be careful, because there's a lot of bolts of a different length. This one with the big washer on it is going to go down in here, and I kind of take that most of the way home first. It's a real short one here. Then we have two long ones, and they go here and here. Now the rest of them are all similar in length, but we have two different lengths, so you got to kind of see. If you put them in, you'll see if they're too long, in which case you replace it with one of the shorter ones. But you could probably rewind this as you're doing it. These bolts go here and here. Then we have the final 5 bolts. Just go here, 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 and here. Take our alignment studs out, and we tighten down all the bolts. Now all these bolts we're going to torque to 50 to 55 inch-pounds. Right, now we can turn it over, and we're going to tighten these couple bolts that we had left loose before. This plate we're going to kind of hold against that valve and tighten those bolts down. Now this is also a good time to make sure that this seal is in place. We discussed this in the video that deals with removing and replacing this valve body, which you should watch if you haven't already, because obviously you're going to need to remove and replace this thing to do the shift kit. Alright, another thing that comes up a lot is the manual valve. Alright, in the instructions, it's going to have you install this little plug in there. And now to do that, there's 2 steps in this valve. You need to get a grinder and you need to grind out the outer part. Because what's going to happen if you don't is when you drive this plug in, it's going to collapse it. When it gets to the second level, it's going to no longer be tight. In my opinion, the best suggestion that I can make is don't even bother with this. Alright, it does almost nothing for you. People break the manual valve putting it in. It's just easier, and in my opinion better, to leave the manual valve alone and just install it in the valve body. that you're going to completely skip that step. Okay, one other thing, there's a 10 millimeter head pressure plug. Just do yourself a favor and make sure that that's tight. There's an O-ring under there, but it doesn't come in the shift kit. It doesn't usually go bad, but they can loosen up. Make sure it's tight, or what you're going to have is slipping forward clutch. But that's about it. We're done. That's all there is to it.
Please like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.